The simulation on the use of force in Chechnya by the United States Institute for Peace is an interactive way to show the various perspectives of the conflict. The simulation explored the conflict from both sides, with the students representing individuals from all aspects of Russian and Chechen society. Exploring Track 2 diplomacy is an effort to bring together influential members of the parties to a conflict in an unofficial capacity to explore joint problem solving. Track 2 diplomacy allows for open communications between groups involved in conflict without worrying about negotiating an outcome. The simulation shows that by opening discussions with various groups involved in conflicting nations in a neutral manner, an understanding of the other side may develop. While Track 1 diplomacy structures the peacemaking process, the Track 2 diplomacy complements the official process by creating unofficial dialogue. The Russian-Chechen conflict has been ongoing for decades with no true end in sight. The Russian conquest of the Caucasus led to the shaping of a tenuous relationship based on different cultural and religious beliefs, in addition to the discrimination and brutal treatment by the Russians. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Chechnya, like many other former Soviet states, sought independence from Russia. Instead of allowing Chechnya to become an autonomous republic, Russia deployed troops into the region. This officially launched the Russian-Chechen conflict. By 1994, tensions between the nations escalated into warfare. Despite the strength of the former Soviet military, Russia withdrew defeated in 1996 after the death of tens of thousands of Chechen civilians. The chaos of the first Russo-Chechen conflict drew Islamic extremists into Chechnya. The extremists overtook the Chechen fight for independence and made the war with Russia into a terrorist fight. The chaotic nature of the type of conflict in Chechnya means there is no right or wrong way to declare or categorize the cause of conflict. Seeking literature that will define and explain the conflict in Chechnya is easy. However, finding literature that will truly determine the root cause is as difficult as actually agreeing on how to end the conflict. Maria Yevzyukova wrote an excellent paper that gives historical background to the Russian-Chechen conflict. She also details the context of the conflict by breaking down the issues, the parties involved, and the cultural differences that have led to a lack of resolution. Yevzyukova offers alternative solutions within her paper that may or may not lead to a resolution, or at least a different way to look at the conflict. And of course, the United States Institute of Peace document that details the simulation is jam-packed with information. Not only does it explain the assignment, but it gives background and history to the conflict. The simulation assignment gives a brief background of the major players in the conflict and their perspectives on the methods of possible resolution. To successfully resolve a conflict, a form of mediation is often necessary. Including an unbiased third party into peace conversations often allows the peaceful settlement of disputes and resolution of any conflict. Mediation must include the following traits according to the United Nations. Preparedness. A well-prepared and supported mediator is able to manage expectations, maintain a sense of urgency while avoiding quick-fix solutions, and effectively respond to opportunities and challenges in the overall process. Consent. The process must be voluntary by both parties and may be given in stages. Impartiality. A mediator must avoid bias. However, that does not mean that the mediator is neutral. Mediators for organizations such as the UN have certain universal principles they must uphold. Inclusivity. It's extremely important to ensure that all parties have a voice, not just the conflicted parties. They must have a way to participate even if they are not present. Ownership. Related to inclusivity is national ownership. Mediation should not be viewed as something imposed by outsiders, but accepted by everyone that will be affected. It should not just be the leaders. Inclusiveness is part of ownership. International laws and norms. Mediators need to work with the framework of international law and within the mandate of the organization that they represent. So a mediator working for the UN and one working for the OAS may have different mandates. However, they will both be working under international law. coherence, coordination, and complementarity of the mediation effort. There can be a wide variety of NGOs, IGOs, and civil society groups involved in the process. It's essential that they not work against each other, but for a common cause. Since the Cold War, new methods of conflict resolution have emerged. These strategies deviate from the zero-sum logic of the international conflict as a confrontation of interests. One strategy is called conflict transformation. This is the effort to reach accommodation between parties in conflict through interactive processes that lead to reconciling tensions, redefining interests, or finding a common ground. This strategy departs radically from the logic of enduring national interests by making two related presumptions: that interests and conflicts of interest are to some degree socially constructed and malleable, and that it is possible for groups to redefine their interests to reduce intergroup tension and suspicion and to make peaceful settlements more possible. A second strategy that is being used is structural prevention. Structural prevention involves creating organizations or institutionalized systems of laws and rules that establish and strengthen nonviolent channels for adjudicating intergroup disputes, accommodating conflicting interests, and transforming conflicts by transforming common ground. Structural prevention typically focuses on the problem of culturally divided states, especially those with weak democratic traditions, deep ethnic divisions, and histories of collective violence perpetrated by one group against another or by past governments against civilian populations. Various tools are available for structural prevention, including institutions for transitional justice, reconciliation, laws and policies to accommodate linguistic and religious differences, and the development and support of institutions of civil society. In previous eras, the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states provided that sovereigns had license to control conflicts within their borders, free from outside influence. Although this norm was often breached by the great powers acting in their own national interests within their spheres of influence, it was rarely overturned in favor of universal principles that held all states responsible to common standards. This situation began to change in the later decades of the Cold War, when norms such as human rights, democratic control, and self-determination of peoples were increasingly invoked against states that abused their citizens. There are signs that universal norms, many of which are stated in the United Nations Charter and other international documents, are becoming embodied in transnational institutions that can exert influence onto states. For example, human rights norms have, through the operations of the CSCE and the OSCE, provided increasing leverage for international community to curb organized state violence against minority groups. Continuing dialogue about the tension in international law between the norm of non-interference on the one hand and those of human rights and self-determination of peoples on the other may be leading toward a new international consensus on how to provide for the rights of minorities. To summarize, the simulation experience showed the various reasons why there is such difficulty in resolving the conflict in Chechnya. Not only is there decades of ethno-political problems, there are recent humanitarian offenses that need to be resolved. The Russian-Chechen conflict simulation shows that there are many complexities within the conflict that need to be resolved individually. There is no easy solution to the dispute, and the simulation presented the issues that are at stake for each individual chosen role. Each role had a different vision of the conflict, a different background to relate to the conflict, and different recommendations to resolve the conflict, which was based on their experiences within the conflict. The importance of understanding and developing your role in this simulation only helped to understand the context in which the conflict is unresolvable. In the Russian-Chechen conflict, there is too much historical negativity between the two nations to be able to peacefully mediate and negotiate a resolution with outside help. The New World system that occurred after the Cold War required new strategies of conflict resolution. As interstate conflicts continue to pose serious threats to global security, and global integration makes foreign policy increasingly difficult to organize exclusively around a singular national interest, conflict resolution is going to rely on transnational activities of non-state actors on techniques that do not depend on the traditional definitions of national interest. Nation-states will always remain important actors in international relations, but a more complex, multidimensional world where there needs to be a balance between both state and non-state interests. NGOs have become, in many ways, more prominent than states in resolving international conflict. They have contributed to the development and enforcement of new international norms by promoting and monitoring conditions of human rights, treatment of minorities, and democratic governance, and by arguing for international organizations to use their resources and influence to hold states to international consistency. The NGOs have become conduits for international aid, with their increasing political clout to influence diplomats to the techniques of conflict resolution. To be effective, NGOs must be accepted as unbiased, democratic, accountable, trustworthy the principles they promote. The dynamics of conflict resolution is constantly changing with the transforming international system. Taking an active role within the global community can help better understand the conflict and establish ways to achieving a peaceful resolution.